Everyone. Thank you so much to Robert, David, and Evelyn for helping put together this event. I'm really excited to be here today to discuss my book project, Emerging Technologies, Implications and Prospects of Their Proliferation. And for today's presentation, I'll have some key insights for Japan and for other parts of East Asia, but I'd be really excited to hear from you all about your thoughts, your feedback, your comments and questions, especially as I finalize my book project. I'm an international security postdoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I just finished my PhD, as David noted, last year. I actually was supposed to be in Japan, South Korea, and China in 2020, but obviously something happened that did not make me come out to East Asia. So I'm very grateful to be here and to have this opportunity at Temple to present on my book project. In brief, my work looks at defining and operationalizing dual-use emerging technologies. And by dual use, I mean having both military and civilian applications. And I look across different geographic areas across time. So technology infiltrates almost every aspect of our lives, from the phones in our hands to the computers in front of us, and yes, even in cinema. Many of us may have seen these three movies: The Matrix, Iron Man, and WALL-E. In The Matrix, we have Neo, who partakes in a cyber simulation. In Iron Man, we have Tony Stark, the industrialist, who has a right-hand man named Jarvis. And for those who may not know, Jarvis stands for just a really very intelligent system. And this AI system is able to control Tony Stark's industrial weapons, suits, and buildings. And then we have WALL-E, which takes place in the year 2806, and it's about a dystopian society in which humans have abandoned Earth, decide to cruise space while the robots are left behind. These are just three lighthearted examples about the potential futures of technology, but they also discuss in some ways the interaction between technology and society. Rather than focusing on cyber, AI, and robotics with future speculation, we should instead think about these three technologies over time in history. So I want to also talk about the impacts of these three technologies, cyber, AI, and robotics, in more concrete terms. On the left-hand side, we see the number or the average of cyber attacks detected in Japan since 2018. Of course, this is not unique to Japan, right? There's cyber attacks across the globe, something that we should be all aware of when it comes to international security, in the private sector, in academia, governments alike. On the right-hand side, you'll notice that there is a news article about a fake video, a deep fake of the prime minister. And of course, this type of deep fake with artificial intelligence could allow for different types of political opposition, make discord across the community and society. And it's important to note that it's not really true in terms of imagery or video. On the bottom half, I wanted to highlight some unmanned aerial vehicles, or otherwise known as drones. We see that with Japan, it's ramping up types of development in drones. And in fact, a news article came out last year that the United States, Australia, and Japan are coming together to cooperate when it comes to military drones. So here, I just want to underscore that there is a blend of military and civilian applications of AI, robotics, and cyber technology. In my research, I look at technology, of course, that's the main focus, but I also think about how they may impact different types of governments, including democracies and authoritarian regimes. Here on the outside of the Venn diagram, you'll see some of the articles that I've published when it comes to technology, democracy, and security. But for today's core focus, I'll focus on the book project, which is about emerging technologies over time. Here's a brief overview of my book project. Today's presentation, I'll focus on chapters 1 and 2, where I'll conceptualize and operationalize emerging technologies and their proliferation. I'll also highlight a US and China case study when it comes to AI, robotics, and cyber. The other chapters are key on AI, robotics, and cyber. Happy to talk about that during the Q&A. And then last but not least, my final chapter discusses some policy considerations when it comes to emerging technologies, which is, as David noted, a very hot topic. 6-7 years ago, somebody told me emerging technology was a very niche topic to be working on. I'm so glad that I stuck with my judgment of continuing with the PhD, and very happy to be here to be talking about emerging technologies. Okay, so for today's presentation, I'm going to highlight my research question as to the conditions in which dual-use emerging technologies proliferate. I'll share some of the motivating factors for my research, and then I'll bring forth an illustrative example that demonstrates different types of technologies, including frontier technologies, emerging technologies, and mature technologies. In this example, I'll look at quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and GPS using open source data. In the second half of this presentation, I'll underscore my argument, the conditions of why certain emerging technologies proliferate, and this is across both governments as well as the private sector. Then I'll move on to talk about my case study, where I'll look at AI, robotics, and cyber technology, specifically spanning the US and China. And then I'll conclude with the larger policy considerations for the community here. Okay, so we'll start off with the core research question. Under what conditions do dual-use emerging technologies proliferate in the international system? And again, dual use, I mean military and civilian applications. I argue that their proliferation is mediated by two neglected factors. One, the pathways of technological acquisition. Here I mean foreign acquisition or indigenous development. And second, the governance or lack thereof of these technologies by international institutions. I want to preview my argument, and I'll go into depth, especially in the second half of the presentation. But to start off with the pathways of technological acquisition, there are three main factors that help shape the pathways. One, the role of accessibility or difficulty of the development of tech. Two, related barriers to entry. And three, states' willingness to share or not to share the technology. For example, an emerging technology that is difficult in development has high barriers to entry, and states are willing to share the technology will have greater capacity for foreign acquisition. Now, in contrast, an emerging technology that's low in difficulty in development, there's lower barriers to entry, and states are not willing to share this technology will be constrained to the indigenous development pathway. Second, the governance of these emerging technologies within international institutions is important to note. Here, an emerging technology that's highly embedded within IOs would lead to lower proliferation, whereas a lowly embedded technology within international institutions would lead to higher proliferation. So what's the bottom line up front, the BLUF? Well, we should pay considerable attention to how these technologies are acquired, whether that's foreign acquisition or indigenous development, and two, how international institutions play an important role. By doing this, we can better understand the vulnerabilities and risks to the international system. So I have several motivating factors for my research. One, to be very blunt and honest, we don't have a consensus on what an emerging technology is. There's a lot of buzzwords when it comes to emerging tech. It's hot right now. But across different stakeholders, what is an emerging technology? And my work seeks to do that. Two, there are various stakeholders that are interested in emerging technologies. These include country, governments, the private sector, academia, and so forth. And here I just highlight one quote from Japan's former Science and Technology Minister who said, "Emerging technologies such as the Internet of Things, 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum technology not only produce economic benefits, but have the potential to affect civil liberties, human rights, and even national security." Here, I just want to highlight again this blending across different aspects of society when it comes to dual-use innovation. And last but not least, my book project focuses on three emerging technologies, AI, robotics, and cyber, because these three technologies were largely developed in the 1950s, and therefore I had this opportunity to track their trajectories over time. I have a multi-method approach that looks at this question. First, I've conducted over 25 semi-structured interviews. This includes going to Germany and Hamburg and Berlin, as well as Silicon Valley in the United States. Unfortunately, in 2020, I wasn't able to come, but I'm here now for Japan, and I'll leave to Seoul tomorrow to interview different types of community stakeholders when it comes to emerging tech. Second, I've compiled open source data, which is about 2 million observations. So here I'm looking at patents through the World Intellectual Property Organization, publications through the website Archive, financial investment through the United States' RDT&E, or Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation, and phase-specific awards through the National Science Foundation and the Small Business Innovation Research Program. And then third, I have a case study again about AI, robotics, and cyber within the context of the United States and China. Okay, so certainly I'm not the first person to think about emerging technologies. This is a topic that is global in nature. So I've conducted an extensive literature review. In political science, scholars say that emerging technologies are game changers in military and strategic affairs. Science and technology scholars say that emerging technologies are science-based innovations that have the ability to disrupt an industry, transform it, or completely create a new one. I think that these are important descriptions of emerging technologies, but they don't necessarily tell us what makes an emerging technology emerging, and my book project seeks to provide that type of assessment. Second, I looked to the literature on international institutions. International institutions are where stakeholders like countries, as well as non-state actors, can come together to reduce transaction costs, talk about cooperation, as well as increase accountability and transparency. Third, I looked at the literature on the diffusion of military technologies. Here, I just want to highlight one author, Michael Horowitz. His book from 2010 looks at the all-big gun battleship, aircraft carrier, and the use of nuclear weapons. And he argues that there are two main drivers when it comes to military tech adoption. One, financial capacity, and two, internal organizational capacity, which is about recruitment and training. I think that these are important explanations, but they're not the whole picture. So to sum up, my question is, under what conditions do dual-use emerging technologies proliferate in the international system? I argue that proliferation is mediated by pathways of technological acquisition, so foreign acquisition or indigenous development, and two, the governance or lack thereof of these technologies by international institutions. And I have a multi-method approach that brings in interviews, quantitative data, and case study analysis. Okay, I've talked a lot about how we don't have consensus on what an emerging technology is, so I'd like to provide you with my type of understanding. So I'm going to draw on an analogy from economics. Economists think of markets as frontier, emerging, and mature markets. I like to think of technology as frontier, emerging, and mature technologies. So let's think about this as a temporal horizon. We'll start off with frontier technologies, which are in the basic research and development phase. These technologies have a lot of uncertainty. They're at the very beginning of the phase. And there's some type of investment, but not nearly enough compared to mature technology. So on the other end of the spectrum, mature technologies are those that are largely established, have penetrated the economy, and are not expected to grow at the same pace that once characterized its development. So an example of a frontier tech would be like quantum computing or nanospace probes. A mature technology example could be like the steam engine. In the middle, we have emerging technologies, which is my main focus. Emerging technologies have increasing prominence. There's some, of course, level of risk and uncertainty, but these technologies are considered high risk, but also high reward. So examples include AI, robotics, and cyber technology. Okay, on this slide, I took it a step further to try to think of what are the criteria when it comes to demarcating a frontier tech, emerging tech, and mature technology. We'll just focus on the blue column in the middle. So the first 5 criteria come from the work of Rotolo et al. From 2015. And these scholars say that an emerging technology can be defined by having radical novelty, relatively fast growth, coherence, prominent impact, and uncertainty. I would like to add to this understanding of emerging technologies with my 3 C's: complexity, connectivity, and comparative performance. So if we go from the top to bottom, radical novelty is about how new and innovative the tech is. Relatively fast growth is about how the technology grows over time. Coherence is about how the technology gains consensus of its purpose. Prominent impact is about how the technology is viewed by different multiple data sources. And uncertainty is about how the technology is not yet finished. Complexity, one of my criterion, is about the feasibility of the technology, the application of the tech itself. Connectivity is about how the technology is associated with the span of technologies. And then comparative performance is about how the technology measures up to other similar technologies across different parameters, such as speed, power, and quality. So I've taken those criteria and thought of ways that we could look at this quantitatively. So across different data sources, if we were to think about novelty, I would look for the question of, is this technology appearing for the first time in the data? With level of growth, I would look at, is this technology appearing more often over time? Coherence, I'm looking at, is this technology appearing in locations such as records of abstracts? Prominence, I'm looking at, is this technology appearing across different sources and organizations? Uncertainty is about how the technology is not yet finished, so this takes on a non-quantitative nature. Complexity is synonymous with feasibility, so here I'm looking at the application definition of the tech. Connectivity is about how it's associated with the span of technologies. And then last but not least, this comparative performance takes on a non-quantitative nature. I compare technologies across these different aspects. So I promised you an illustrative example. So looking at a frontier tech, I'm going to look at quantum computing. With emerging tech, I'll look at artificial intelligence. And GPS, I'll look at as a mature technology. The data source that I'll be looking at is coming from the Small Business Innovation Research Program from the US. For those who may not know, SBIR actually helps fund a diverse portfolio of technology startups and businesses, helps to increase commercialization, and so forth. This data set has about 65,000 entries and spans from 2010 to 2016. So before I go into the quantitative analysis, I just want to share some expectations that I have when it comes to the criteria. With radical novelty and relatively fast growth, I would expect a frontier tech to show up fewer times compared to a mature technology, and emerging technologies to be quite in the middle. With coherence and prominent impact, again, I would expect a similar direction. And with complexity, this is about feasibility of the tech. So here I'm looking at phase 1, which is about the development of the tech, versus phase 2 is, if phase 1 is successful, let's continue to execute this. So here, I would expect a frontier tech to show up more in phase 1 compared to phase 2. And I would expect mature technologies to have more entries in general with phase 1 and phase 2, and emerging technologies to be in this middle portion. So let's look at radical novelty. The question is this technology showing up in the data? So we're looking at quantum computing with the frontier tech. In 2010, it shows up 1 time. Artificial intelligence as an emerging tech shows up 3 times, and GPS shows up 32 times in 2010. My expectation here is supported. With relatively fast growth, I'm looking at across this time period of 10 years. So with quantum, we see 6 observations. AI has 115 observations, and GPS has 316 observations. This can be seen in the time series below, where gray indicates GPS, orange indicates AI, and blue indicates quantum computing. Same can be said about coherence, where I'm looking across different abstracts, this increasing trend, as well as prominent impact, which looks at different organizations and offices, again, from quantum AI to GPS. And this is my favorite criterion, because this is where we're looking at phase 1 versus phase 2 development. So here with quantum, we see that it has 7 observations in phase 1 compared to 1 observation in phase 2, bottom left pie chart. AI has 129 observations in phase 1 compared to 42 observations in phase 2, middle pie chart. And GPS has 455 observations in phase 1 compared to 306 observations phase 2, bottom right pie chart. I know I threw out a ton of numbers at you, but what's interesting to me is that a quantum computing like a frontier tech largely shows up smaller compared to GPS as a mature technology, and we see AI quite in the middle. So if anybody was interested in this type of framework, we could put in different types of technologies with frontier, emerging, mature technology with this type of data set. Okay, so let's move on to the outcome variable, like what am I actually interested in? How these technologies proliferate or do not proliferate. So I want to share with you how I define proliferation, which is in 2 stages. Phase 1 is about the possession of the technology, and phase 2 is about operationality. I define the first phase as an actor's ability to have the proficiency of skills, hardware, and software related to the technology. So if we were to think about possession, actors like states and non-state actors need to have a toolkit of complex and intricate skills. They need to have the hardware related to the technology, but also the software and components of the innovation. But this is just the first phase, a necessary condition. The second phase is actually about using and successfully doing the technology. So I've given a few examples here when it comes to cyber, AI, and robotics. A few examples of cyber could include hacking, ransomware, and information operations. Artificial intelligence includes large language models and machine learning techniques. And robotics is about how it can be programmable to complete its designated tasks. And in my robotics chapter, I specifically look at drones. So let me just go back really quickly. To sum up possession and operationality, this is the 3 S's: stuff, skills, and success. So how do I operationalize proliferation? At the beginning of the presentation, I noted that I look at different data sets, about 2 million observations. So I looked at patents through the World Intellectual Property Organization, the US's RDT&E for financial allocation, and publications with archive. So this first phase is actually about having the components that are necessary for the tech. The second phase is about the successful use of the tech. So I look to phase-specific awards through the Small Business Innovation Research Program and the National Science Foundation. I won't go through all the data sets. Happy to talk about them during Q&A or if anybody wants to discuss it further offline. But I'll just show you maybe some examples when it comes to the first phase and the second phase. So archive, I think many of us may have heard of archive here. This is where scholars like you and I can upload papers from political science, economics, computer science, and so forth. The data set that I've collected has about 1.8 million observations and spans from 2007 to 2020. And here, I just want to show you some trends when it comes to AI, robotics, and cyber technology through this data set. So here with AI, over this 13-year time period, we see a very slow and gradual increase in papers related to the tech. With robotics technology, we see a greater increase in the number of papers for this innovation on archive. And of the 3, we see the greatest amount of papers related to this technology for cyber through archive. So I'll move on to discuss one data set for operationality. This is the National Science Foundation. Many of us probably have heard of NSF. This was established in 1950 to help establish the country's security and enhance it, promote the economy, and foster global leadership and innovation. This data set that I've collected has about 63,000 entries and spans from 2016 to 2021. So I'm just going to show you very quickly some trends when it comes to AI, robotics, and cyber. So if we take maybe a few seconds, we see that artificial intelligence has the least amount of phase-specific awards devoted to the tech compared to robotics, which has a moderate level of awards, and cyber technology having the greatest amount of phase-specific awards for the technology. So bottom line, all 3 technologies are increasing in time when it comes to phase-specific awards, but the rate in which these technologies are growing is important to note. So to recap my argument, the question is, under what conditions do dual-use emerging technologies proliferate in the international system? And I argue that the pathways of acquisition and the governance or lack thereof by international institutions help mediate the proliferation. My first hypothesis is the likelihood of proliferation of emerging technologies will increase for those that lend themselves to a higher degree of foreign acquisition compared to those that must be made indigenously. Here, I argue and highlight that the difficulty of the tech, the related barriers to entry, and states' willingness or unwillingness to share the tech all help shape the pathway. So, for example, foreign acquisition theoretically offers a quick and cheap way to get to the technology, but it places the recipient's security at the mercy of the provider. Now, with indigenous development, this takes time, resources, and skills to get to the innovation. So these are the trade-offs that actors, including countries and non-state actors, have to think about when it comes to acquiring technology. I want to share some expectations that I have before we dive into the analysis portion when it comes to AI, robotics, and cyber technology. So with AI, especially with large language models, there's a high level of difficulty or accessibility for the development of these types of models. There's high barriers to entry, which include the software and hardware related to the tech. And states may be unwilling to share this technology. Thus, I highlight that this could be constrained to the indigenous development pathway by actors. Now, with robotics, there's a moderate level of difficulty or accessibility to the tech. There's some barriers to entry, but states can be willing to share this technology, highlighting a greater capacity for foreign acquisition. And here with robotics, I specifically look at unmanned aerial vehicles. With cyber technology, there's greater accessibility for this tech. It's cheap, it's easy, there's low barriers to entry, and states can get this off the shelf. So highlighting that both states and non-state actors could get this from abroad or make it indigenously. So what would I look for then when it comes to the indigenous development pathway versus the foreign acquisition pathway? With indigenous development, I would expect to see export controls or choke points. I would expect that with indigenous development, patents would be higher because you have to devote those resources. You're not able to get the tech from abroad. I would expect publications to be on the lower end due to the difficulty of the technology, and that there would be some level of increasing investments over time. Now, with foreign acquisition, I would expect to see a widening global market to export and import this tech. I would expect patents and publications to be moderate because you don't have to devote those resources within house. And I would expect investments to also be on the average end. Moving on to my second hypothesis, the likelihood of proliferation will increase for those that are not associated with international institutions and transparency. International institutions, I argue, are important because actors can come together to define the emerging technology and build consensus towards it. 2, think about the uses and, more importantly, the misuses of the technology through legislation or potential frameworks. And 3, ways to monitor or increase transparency for the technology. What I've done on this slide is track some international institutions with artificial intelligence, robotics, and cyber technology from a global perspective. Of course, by no means is this an exhaustive list, but I've tried to track this especially in the past 7 years. And what we see is that AI has quite a few international institutions. We see a moderate level when it comes to robotics, and with cyber technology, we see the least amount of IOs related to the tech. So what would I then expect to see when it comes to these emerging technologies with IOs? With a highly embedded tech in IOs or international organizations, I would expect to see substantial governance efforts, such as laws and frameworks. I would expect that phase-specific awards or the operationality of the tech will be on the limited end. Here, with a moderately embedded tech within international institutions, I would expect there to be some level of governance efforts, but there would be loopholes, and that could allow for some proliferation of the innovation. And I would expect phase-specific awards to be average. With a lowly embedded tech within IOs, I would expect to have very minimal governance efforts, such as non-binding actions. And I would expect phase-specific awards, therefore, to be substantial. So like any good political scientist, we have a 2x2. So especially with my dissertation, I had to have a 2x2. Okay, so top half, we look at pathways of technological acquisition. Left side, we're going to look at the level of embeddedness within IOs or international organizations. So let's just start off with the top left box. An emerging technology that is constrained to the indigenous development pathway and is highly embedded within international institutions, I would expect proliferation to be least likely. Now let's do a contrast, so bottom right box. An emerging technology where there's greater capacity for foreign acquisition and is lowly embedded within international institutions, I would expect proliferation to be most likely. And then if there's some level of foreign acquisition, some level of embeddedness within IOs, I would expect proliferation to be somewhat likely, this diagonal in the 2x2. So here, I would expect AI to be least likely to proliferate, robotics to be the likely tech to proliferate, and cyber technology to be the most likely technology to proliferate. So moving on to the case study analysis, I look at the United States and China with respect to AI, robotics, and cyber technology. I don't think I need to convince many people in this room that the US and China are important to study when it comes to emerging technologies like these three for a number of reasons: national and international security, economic benefits as well as challenges, and the aspect of innovation, who's at the leading edge when it comes to AI, robotics, and cyber technology. We're going to start off first with artificial intelligence. We'll start with the US and then go to China. With the United States, the country has enforced a number of restrictions when it comes to the exporting of AI. This includes the 2018 Export Control Reform Act, as well as the 2022 CHIPS Act, and the Bureau of Industry and Security restrictions. In this manner, we see that the United States is trying to develop the technology within-house, but at the same time constrain it from going abroad, especially to our adversaries. When it comes to the governance aspect of artificial intelligence, there's a number of organizations that the country is involved in, including the Open Ethics Initiative, Council on Big Data Ethics Society, and so forth. In this manner, we see that there is some level of priority when it comes to governing this type of technology. With China, the country, President Xi Jinping has said that it's seeking to reduce its external dependence for key technologies and advanced equipment. And as a result of certain export controls and restrictions, we see that the country has been facing a level of challenges when it comes to core AI components. We can talk about semiconductors also during the Q&A. At the same time, we see that China also is dealing with the issue of high-end talent. Of course, it's quite large when it comes to talent, but thinking about not having the hardware or potential software components can make an obstacle for its way forward. On this slide, I want to just highlight the global perspective when it comes to large language models or significant machine learning systems. You could also find this publicly through the Stanford HAI, or the Human Institute for Artificial Intelligence. On the left-hand side, we see that the United States is in the leading side with 16, United Kingdom, half of that at 8, and then more than half of that at 3 with China. Also can be seen on the right-hand side by geographic areas. With robotics technology, we see that the United States, there's a number of manufacturers that are foreign-owned, like KUKA, Fanuc, and the ABB Group. Indeed, there are companies, especially from my hometown in Cambridge, like Boston Dynamics, where it has worked with other companies to pledge about safely developing this type of technology, also considering the dual-use aspect of these types of innovations. The United States has also been involved in organizations like the International Organization for Standardization, TCO 299, which has come out with 26 international standards on safely developing, designing, and exporting these types of innovations. Now with China, China is currently the biggest shareholder when it comes to the global market for robotics. Its net worth is $30 billion. It's only increasing over time. I've already mentioned Boston Dynamics. You may have seen a very similar robot on Twitter or social media platforms, Spot on the left-hand side. This is Boston Dynamics. It runs and jumps from boxes. It can go really quickly. Right-hand side, the gray one is Unitree, a Chinese company. And it can do very similar aspects to Spot. Spot costs $74,500. Unitree's version costs a fraction of that, $2,400. Just want to highlight the aspect of how potentially easy it could be to develop certain innovations and export it to a number of different stakeholders. Now, with cyber technology, I mentioned that it's quick, it's cheap, it's easy. With respect to the United States, it said that it believes in a free, open, and secure cyberspace. But indeed, there's competing visions of how to develop and govern this type of domain. You probably have heard of Mark Zuckerberg's famous quote of move fast and break things. This is about rapidly developing innovation, but this doesn't put a lot of emphasis on the potential repercussions for society. Now, with China has pursued a stance of this concept called cyber sovereignty. This is about utilizing certain technologies or innovations to protect its national homeland and territories. China is the highest originator of distributed denial of service attacks. This is where potential stakeholders could create zombie networks, which ultimately make it overwhelmed for the actor to make it unusable. And while I note that about China, the United States follows closely behind. I just want to make a note of that, as well as Brazil. So this just highlights the contested rules of the road when it comes to the cyber domain. In some of my open source research, I've seen some work from Major General Hao of the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, who has put forth China's stance of protecting, again, its national homeland through national governance. Now, this is in contrast to Western stances, which is about a multi-stakeholder environment that brings in governments, the private sector, non-profit organizations when it comes to developing and designing the cyberspace domain. Now, if we lack a consensus of what cyber is, how it's applied to the domain, then this could potentially allow for greater proliferation of this type of innovation. And here, coming from a cybersecurity firm called FireEye, this just highlights the number of actors that are leveraging this type of innovation. This is about 1,900 groups. They come from all over the world, including countries, but not limited to the Russian Federation, China, Vietnam, North Korea, and so forth. Now, those are some state-sponsored groups. There's also non-state sponsored groups, as well as some financially motivated groups. And so here, I just want to highlight maybe the low barriers, as well as the ease in which some actors can get this technology from off the shelf. I've created a few maps when it comes to the overall proliferation of AI, robotics, and cyber technology. In dark blue, we'll see some of the leading countries when it comes to AI. You know, I think a lot of folks think that AI is something that you can do in your basement, and that's not necessarily the case when it comes to certain large language models. The need for hardware, software, the components behind that, as well as some of the expertise is important to note. Now, with robotics technology, we see a greater amount of exporters, importers of this type of unmanned aerial vehicles, and some moderate level of governance efforts. And with cyber technology, we see the greatest amount of proliferation. Again, there's a lack of consensus of how to develop and design this type of innovation, but also how easily acquire this type of innovation can be by different stakeholders. Now, to move towards the concluding parts of my presentation, I just want to highlight some of the policy implications of my work. First and foremost, I think we need a common language to discuss what an emerging technology is and how to assess that through different criteria. This could help facilitate empirical research into the innovation literature, but also thinking about other types of emerging technologies, which hasn't been my focus. Second, I've been very lucky to brief my work to the Department of State from the US, DARPA, which is a Defense Advanced Research Program agency, the Chief Digital AI Office, and OpenAI. I am a researcher with OpenAI. We can talk about ChatGPT during the Q&A if that's of interest. But yeah, so it's a multi-stakeholder environment. It's not just thinking about governments, it's also the private sector, it's also academics like you and I that are utilizing and leveraging emerging technologies. And then last but not least, all three innovations are proliferating, but the extent and evidence of their variation proliferation is notable. And ultimately, we have the tools to assess the risk of these technologies moving forward. Now, I just want to take maybe a minute or two to highlight some policy implications for Japan and emerging technologies, and just highlight this quote. The government of Japan is doing everything it can to encourage various players, including startups and hidden gems among small and medium-sized enterprises, to come up with brand new and innovative ideas to provide the world with solutions. And I think through some of the interviews that I've conducted this week, this is certainly the case that has been pointed about moving forward with creativity, innovation, society 5.0, and so forth, and thinking about innovation in the future. In terms of collaboration, Japan's AI strategy underscores cooperation with countries like the United States. And here are some of the core priorities, such as biotechnology, AI, quantum, information sciences, and civil space. And then last but not least, I just want to underscore that Japan is a country that's seriously thinking about innovation, seriously thinking about emerging technologies. I would love to hear what your thoughts are when it comes to Japan and emerging technologies. I know many of you have been here for quite some time, so just interested in hearing your overall thoughts about that. So to wrap up, my last slide, I promise, there are a few gaps that I believe that my work has sought to address. One, I thought about how we should conceptualize and operationalize dual-use emerging technologies, which I believe the literature has been lacking. Second, I brought forth some quantitative as well as qualitative data to help us understand emerging tech, such as patents, publications, allocations, phase-specific awards, and the extent of international organizations. And the last but not least, this is indeed a timely topic that includes the policy community, and this will be a comprehensive issue moving forward that brings together different voices from all parts of the world. We could talk about my published work if anybody is interested later on. In terms of my ongoing research, what I'd love to continue beyond the book project is think about the intersection of emerging technologies, so artificial intelligence and cyber, or cyber and unmanned aerial vehicles, because I think that will be the way forward. The complexity of these innovations, the ease in which some of them can be acquired, and the impacts that they have in international security. Okay, so with that, I will wrap up and say thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Well, Julie, thanks so much for that really phenomenally comprehensive and thoughtful presentation. I think, thinking about the way in which you've sort of developed sort of a series of questions and a series of ways to answer those questions with such a complex and sort of difficult challenge, it's really quite an impressive methodology. I'm really excited to see how you can apply it to sort of different technology areas going forward, and that sort of issue that you raised at the end, that kind of complexity, the overlapping and interactions of these technology fields that is, of course, sort of so important when we think about, for example, AI and biotechnology, these other sort of intersections. I'm going to start sort of and abuse the moderator's prerogative with a series of questions that will hopefully take us very quickly from the extraordinarily theoretical right down to the policy, and then turn it over to you. Robert Dujarric always advertises the excellent questions that come from this audience, so please get those ready. So Julie, the first question, probably and very much the most theoretical one, you start with talking about emerging, foundational, mature technologies. How do you define technology? And then the other question is sort of, how do you define dual use? In a world when we think about complex weapon systems, for example, that can fail very easily to the lack of very technologically basic parts in terms of, whether it's a valve, whether it's a shaft, whether it's a wired Xbox controller that goes into control a weapon system on a U.S. sub. These are all sort of technologies that we wouldn't necessarily class as being dual use, and yet their absence sort of can create significant dependencies on the ability for coercion by states or sort of other issues. So what's technology? What's dual use?
Okay. I feel like I'm back at my dissertation defense with my committee. So thank you, David. Okay. So the first question of what is technology? I think this is literally page 1 or 2 of my dissertation. So I define technology as not just the physical components of innovation, but also the processes behind them. And I really do look to the literature or discipline of science and technology studies, as well as political science, because I think there's so much great work that's being done from that discipline. Technology, is about innovation. It's about the processes, the stakeholders behind them. And I think with artificial intelligence, cyber, and robotics, which are my 3 focus areas, these are technologies that quite overlap with one another. So I think it's a complex question, because at the end of the day, these three emerging technologies are overlapping in priority across different stakeholders, and it brings together the hardware and the software components. The question of dual use, I think, is also really important. I define dual use by having both military and civilian applications. I know that's probably not the most concise answer, but when I look at the United States, they came out with a list of 14 critical priorities. AI, robotics, cyber technology, or cybersecurity are 3 of them out of the 14. And all of these priorities are dual use in nature. Something that I don't focus on is biotechnology. And maybe we don't often think about that, but it could have military potential applications. And so I scope my dual use aspect by looking at those 14 priorities, and then scope it even more by looking at just 3. But any one of us could look at another 3 or 6 that I didn't look at. And so it brings together and blends both civilian and military applications.
Fantastic. Well, those are personally sort of questions that I always find challenging, and you answered them much more fluently than I certainly would have put on the spot. So thank you for that. This is another kind of 2-part question I think gets at some of the way that you framed your research and the point that you make about sort of being an IR scholar, a political science scholar who borrows from and utilizes the science, technology, innovation literature. In the IR field, one question I have is, how does the structure of the international system, do you think, influence this? So you highlight the role of international regimes, and of course, regime formation is in part a function of the structure of the international system, and you have scholars like Mark Zachary Taylor who have looked at how threat shapes long-term innovation sort of trends within countries. Is that a variable you've considered or would like to? A related sort of question that brings it to our Japan issue is the work of sort of STI scholars like Christopher Freeman, who talk about kind of the adjacency of different technologies to sort of cultural attributes or to sort of subsystems within politics, economics, demographics, et cetera. And to take an example that makes that a little bit more concrete, you highlighted the example of robotics and KUKA, FANUC, ABB. And of course, in Japan, you have this sort of monozukuri bunka, sort of the idea of like your culture that creates things, and that sort of lines up very well with sort of Japan's strengths in terms of certain advanced technology fields, whether it's certain areas of semiconductor machinery production or whether it's sort of robotics. But comparatively, you talk about cyber as something that's easy, and yet Japan is sort of widely acknowledged as being a declining sort of cyber power in many respects. So why might that be, and how does that kind of fit in your framework?
Those are great questions. I'm going to start with the last one and then go backwards. In some of the interviews that I've had this week, I think it's been really enlightening to me about cybersecurity, IT services within Japan. Some of the quotes that I've gotten are that Japan is seriously thinking about innovation, but could be resistant to certain types of change. And I think that could be potentially one reason as to why it's not progressed in certain technology priorities, though that it's noticed that, and I think that's a really great step moving forward, knowing what it may be lacking and how to move forward on that. In that same type of interview, I was told that Japan is also considering not just what it's lacking, but how it could work with other countries when it comes to IT and cybersecurity. And I think that's also a really notable thing about Japan, like-minded countries working together and cooperating. The other question of thinking about the structure of the international system, indeed, my work looks at just 2 factors, right? The pathways of technological acquisition, how these technologies are acquired, whether that's foreign acquisition or indigenous development, and how the role of international institutions also plays an important role. And I think, David, you really highlighted another important factor that my work doesn't really highlight, but I'd love to look at that in surrounding papers or articles. And I think threat is absolutely an important factor. I think everyone here can probably say that threat has shaped the priority, the amount of resources, the level of skills and talent that's going into innovation, not just in Japan, also in the United States, which I can see certainly in the past 7 years in me conducting this type of research, and also in my interviews in Germany. So I think threat is something that can help shape and escalate potential escalation. or tensions over issues, but it could also motivate R&D when it comes to AI, robotics, and cyber technology across different types of innovations. So I'll say thank you to that, and it would be great to work on something like that moving forward.
Well, fantastic, and I promise you we'd start highly theoretical. That's the mid-theory. Let's follow on with a sort of a bit of a practical question.
Sure.
What do you think the implications of, well, let me back up for a second. The United States has clearly decided that it's going to make an effort to deny the People's Republic of China access to certain capabilities, most frequently on the justification that they have sort of dual use or military applications. Yeah. But of course, when we think of something like AI or advanced semiconductors or advanced node semiconductor fabrication equipment, these are of course adjacent to general purpose technologies, the other kind of GPT. They have significant civilian spillover, so you could even argue that they are an effort to slow or halt more general technological progress. What do you think the implications of your research for whether the United States will actually succeed in denying the PRC access to these capabilities? And to put it in the context of Japan as well, do you have any thoughts of, one of the things that sort of, if you notice, if you look at the history of U.S.-Japan relations, in the 1980s, semiconductors were, an extraordinary source of tension. I think there are some of my colleagues in Japan, and I think they have fairly good historical reason, who would blame the United States in a certain extent for the way in which Japan's semiconductor industry evolved in the 80s and into the 90s, where it lost sort of ground, particularly after the Plaza Accords. But now, of course, Japan is not only having a industrial policy-led push for semiconductors, but one that is broadly welcomed by the United States, at least in sort of these initial phases. Say what you will about the Japan Steel case and how that may sort of impact perceptions of U.S.-Japan mutual economic security efforts.
Sure.
But so that kind of two questions of the PRC and whether the U.S. will succeed in denying that capability, and then your thoughts on sort of how sort of Japan is looking at semiconductors and how sort of the U.S. and that relationship has changed.
Okay, awesome questions. So on the question of the PRC and if the U.S. will be successful in stopping China's ability to get certain types of components that are necessary for artificial intelligence, like large language models, I would respond to that by saying that there's no way to stop a certain country from obtaining these types of components. I think that the U.S. could be really useful here in delaying when it comes to certain components like semiconductor chips. Some of the work that I've done in looking at this is through certain interviews that I've obtained, and the Republic of China is thinking about how to get this component through indigenous development. And they're quoting 5 to 10 years in trying to catch up when it comes to certain components like that. On the question of the United States and Japan, and when it comes to the semiconductor business, I think Japan has noted that it has lost some foreground when it comes to that, but is trying to prioritize these resources, and that's also been evident in my interviews as well. And I think that shows a level of progress of trying to devote resources, attention, and skills to this type of innovation, and semiconductors will be important moving forward and so forth when it comes to large language models. That's just one application that's being leveraged. So I am sure that you could speak better to that question, but especially with your colleagues, I'm sure that they're also aware of the challenges and obstacles that have been resistant to change and what it needs to do to overcome those obstacles, and with its cooperation of like-minded countries like the United States.
Well, thanks so much, Julie. I have many other questions that I would like to ask you, and may try to later, but for now, I'll look over to the audience. We already have some hands in the air. When I call on you, please wait for the microphone. We'll collect a batch of questions of sort of 3 to start and give Julie a chance to sort of both consider and then answer them.
Sure.
So the first 3 that I saw were over here, then we'll go to the back, and then we'll come over to the gentleman with the mustache in the second row.
Your works, your research work for the slide, so
Sure.
I think it was towards the end.
Oh, sorry, the published works.
The published works.
Okay, yeah.
So we can look at other things.
Oh, sure.
I was getting lost in the silicon, the matrix of it.
Oh, and please, when you ask a question, do state your name and affiliation to start off, please.
Okay. Excuse me. My name's Kyle Cleveland. I'm a sociologist here at TUJ, and I'm the co-director of the Institute with Robert. I kind of hesitate to ask this question because you might find it a little anodyne. I feel like, in a way, you're playing chess and I'm playing checkers on this issue. But what do you think of ChatGPT and its impact upon academia?
Get the mic to the gentleman in the back there. Actually, the one in front of you. So not the standing, the sitting gentleman. Well, I did see you. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Takito from Sophia University. My question is about your data.
Data.
You mentioned about the number of hours by NSF. But my understanding is when it comes to technology, especially robotics, usually we have a huge investment in medical technology, especially medical device between
Yes.
Japan and the United States.
Yes.
Did you take a look at the NIH-funded research or Department of Defense or Department of Energy, which will be relating to dual-use technology? Thank you.
Great question.
And then the gentleman with the mustache in the second row.
Thank you, David, for pointing out my facial hair. My name's Nick Velez. I'm a master's student at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Washington, D.C., studying international affairs. And I wanted to ask you about when you interviewed people from the State Department, from DARPA and ChatGPT. Obviously, they're in different levels of stakeholders. And I was wondering if you found any nuances and differences across these stakeholders, if there were specific questions that were peculiar to
Yeah.
their industry.
Great question. Okay. So I'll start off with the first question of ChatGPT and its impact on academia. So again, researcher for OpenAI, I'm not speaking on behalf of OpenAI, but how many of you have used ChatGPT? Can I just see like a raise of hands? Okay, a lot more than when I asked my students back in the US, maybe like, I don't even know how many months ago, but this is really interesting because I think ChatGPT has really put forth this ease in asking quick questions and asking for, give me a recipe that is completely vegetarian that includes these ingredients, right? Like, I'm sure some of us have maybe asked questions like that, or please give me a literature review of this topic, right? And it could be helpful for us in terms of assignments. I will say that I don't think OpenAI knew how big ChatGPT was when it first came out. I think that with its record of the number of users, I think it really did shock the company. And I think that, you know, there are folks that were on the waiting list or people who have used it now in the private sector and getting business licenses. And so I think ChatGPT is not this fad that's going to go away. I think that it could be operationalized in different components of society. But your question of its impact or implications for academia, especially as a researcher, we don't want to lose out on creativity. We don't want to lose out on analytical thinking and critical skills. But I think there could be ways that we could learn from ChatGPT in thinking about, you know, different topics that we may not necessarily had the option to, especially during the pandemic. I know that ChatGPT is quote unquote outlawed in certain classrooms, and then other scholars and teachers are saying that ChatGPT is okay. I have a friend who's a high school teacher in New York who has said, we're not allowing ChatGPT. And I think there's a spectrum of different opinions when it comes to it. Of course, we don't want to put in prompts where students say, like, please write me a 3-page essay on this topic, right? And then leaving in the prompt or saying ChatGPT has created this type of aspect of the paper. I think that we want to make sure that ChatGPT can help assist and enhance, but of course not replace critical thinking.
Use it in your classes or allow it to be used?
So in my classroom, I have not outlawed it. I have allowed students to use it for different types of classroom in-room exercises, but definitely during my assignments, such as essays, I can assess whether ChatGPT is used or not. And I think, you know, it's up to each teacher, researcher when it comes to this type of innovation.
Does this map onto what you're discussing? I mean, what you've been discussing.
Sure.
Is a much broader, more inclusive,
Yeah.
complicated matrix of how all of these things interface with state politics.
And Kyle, let me cap you at that two-finger sentence. Others had questions as well, so just so we have a chance to get to them.
The question of, does this map onto my research? I know that with ChatGPT, there were individuals who were concerned of if it could be used in nefarious ways. And I think a main priority for me with my research is thinking about the dual use aspect. Could it be used for military applications? Could it be used just for civilian purposes? And I think with ChatGPT, there were concerns of could it be created and used to make certain weapons? And I think, thinking about the software, the coding behind it is really important, especially with security implications. And I think we have to think about that across different innovations, not just with ChatGPT. This is just one certain type of technology. So thank you for that question. The question of data and robotics, I love that question. So with the NSF, I think that was about 65,000 entries. And with robotics, what I did when I was coding it was look for certain words. And so I've done some robustness checks of certain types of unmanned area vehicles, robotics, and technologies. But I've also seen who are the major stakeholders, and you've listed a few here with the DoD, or Department of Defense, the National Institute of Health, NIH, and I think that's important to note, like who are the main priorities when they're creating and developing these types of innovations. And you're also right to note that there are a lot of medical robotics technologies, and it's important to, I think, decipher which types of innovations are being funded through NSF. So thank you for that question. 3, stakeholders in my interviews. Thank you for that question as well. I will note that in the US, with Silicon Valley, with the companies that I've met with, some of the policy government officials that I've met with, there was a stark difference. When I've talked to some policy officials, they've quoted in saying that the government is not able to fail as much as the private sector is able to based on the funding, time, and resources. And the government is notable in the sense of being held to public opinion, and so they don't have the luxury of failing when it comes to time and resources. And that was in a few of my interviews. The private sector, in contrast, has noted that profit is an important aspect, but also how customers are thinking about using their technologies. So that was a bit of a difference. In my interviews in Germany, priorities were given to transparency and privacy, especially with the General Data Protection Act. And so those are some of the differences that I saw when it comes to US, Germany, and across. But I'm really looking forward to synthesizing my interviews from Japan and from Seoul, South Korea, to see what else has been on the spectrum when it comes to emerging tech.
The difference you said with the U.S. and Germany was that Germany prioritizing information, was that from both public and private, or?
Yeah, it was both public and private,
Thank you.
with companies as well as some government folks that I've met with. Thank you.
All right, I think we'll take in order the gentleman who was overlooked by me previously in the back there, the gentleman, the suit against the back wall, and then the gentlewoman with sort of sitting here in the glasses. Sorry, Kumiko.
Hi, my name is Peter Morris. I'm a lawyer, and then I also write for Asia Times.
Okay, great.
Mostly about Myanmar, but sometimes about China and Japan. And so, I'm just wondering about trade secrets. I mean, you use patent numbers as criteria for a lot of this, and did you consider the extent to which a company would say, okay, I'm going to protect this by trade secret rather than patent? Because like in the case of China, for example, it's like a long time ago, companies started protecting their IP by trade secret instead of patent, because you just lose the IP if you know.
Yeah.
So.
Should I wait or?
Yeah, we'll collect.
Yes, we'll collect. Okay.
Hi, I'm Donald Eubank. I'm a sustainable business advisor. There's been a lot of announcements in the past, let's say 5 years, of digital trade agreements. Japan with the UK, EU, US, Singapore with New Zealand, Australia, and a digital twinning project with Shenzhen in China. I'm wondering, how does this fit into your analysis in terms of helping technology to emerge, to be distributed, or to, I mean, I think it affects all three of those categories you have, cyber,
Yeah.
AI, or robotics potentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. My name is Kumiko Pivot. I'm in the profession to deal with the geopolitical risk. So one of the biggest factors is emerging tech, how it plays the role in the geopolitical risk dislocations. And my question is actually not really about it, but anyway, your study was about how these emerging technologies have developed or proliferated so far in the world that human beings controlled the development. But from now on, just like you were saying, or just like you were dealing with, the AI and all this automated algorithm is having more influence in how people develop, how people research, how social opinions are manipulated, and so on. So would that change the way technologies will spread, or like, are we taking your study as a like basic conditions for the future development and proliferation of the technologies?
That's great. Okay. The first question of trade secrets versus, publishing it through patents, that's absolutely something that I've considered. I think the World Intellectual Property Organization is one data source that could be leveraged when it comes to different types of innovations. It's used quite frequently in economics, but in political science as a discipline, I think that it could be used to highlight how these innovations are being developed and designed. I've looked across countries, of course, but also different types of patent offices. And you're absolutely right to note that there could be stakeholders that say, we don't want to publish this, we don't want to put this out there, we'd rather keep it for ourselves and continue to develop this innovation until we're ready to release it. And I think that is notable for all these innovations. And it's not just specific to China. There's also, I'm sure, stakeholders in the United States and across the globe. But this is something that I have noted.
Well, I'm saying about China, sorry, I should have been more specific, because it's like, especially with dual-use technology, right?
Sure.
It's like, well, why would you patent something if China can just steal it and then develop it into a military,
Yeah. Yeah, so there's something known as NIST. I'm sure you've heard of this. There's some public open hearings that have happened or taken place in the past year and a half that has talked about theft of intellectual property. And something that has been raised is about the potential stealing of this important information to develop innovation. And I think that's something that's been on the radar with these hearings within the United States. And I think it's an issue that will be global, and especially with dual-use technologies that could have implications for different parts of society. It's going to be something that is comprehensive across international organizations. It's what I've seen through the European Union AI Act. It's something that I've seen through the United Nations Global Partnership on AI, or OECD's version of that. So I think it's something that's on the top of the mind for across different stakeholders.
And Julie, if I can add one thing to
Yeah,
that.
please.
It's quite interesting that you asked that question. One part of Japan's economic security law, of course, the fourth pillar of it is sort of a patent non-disclosure system.
Yeah.
And that that's sort of a novel thing for
great.
Japan, though, of course, in the United States, such a system has existed since 1938 and then was sort of maintained after the war by act of Congress. So
Yeah.
we do certainly see that trend exactly as you describe it, though how widespread, I think, given that's the absence of data, it's quite hard to measure.
Yeah, it's hard to measure that. The question of digital agreements, that's something that I haven't yet done, but I think you're really apt to bring that up. I know that this is something that's been increasingly important across different countries, but also different regional organizations. And I think that with AI, robotics, and cyber, that's something else, that's another dimension of how to assess proliferation. So I'm going to note that down and think about that for spreading of these technologies. So thank you for that suggestion. The third question, geopolitical risk, and how humans have been at the forefront when it comes to decision making, but now potentially thinking about, I think this is, if I'm correctly understanding, if humans weren't so much at the forefront and we allowed for automated types of systems or algorithms to take priority, right? Okay, I did understand that. That's a really meta question, I think, in a great way, because I think we are at a critical juncture of thinking about human-centered decision-making versus thinking about automated system decision-making. I know with the United States, the Bill of AI Rights, and thinking about will humans have the ability to review the information and how that information is used and spread across transparency and privacy issues. I think that civil society is aware of that. I hope that more information is being done to advocate for humans when it comes to decision making, and that we don't necessarily allow for machines to take over, right? I think that would be the priority for many of us here in this room, is for us to be the ones in control. I wrote an op-ed last year called, how the United States can think about artificial intelligence. It's in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And I discussed what it means to be human-centered and what it means to be AI-centered and how it needs to be a mutually respectful relationship. So I'd love to send that to you to maybe share a little bit more about my thoughts behind that, especially with dual-use technologies like AI. Thank you.
Julie, a bit of a follow-on to that
Yeah.
is just, there's a lot of metaphors that get used to talk about AI or data. Thinking about this issue of decision-making and human on the loop and the loop, these things.
Yeah.
Are there any of them that are, particular favorites, or do you think actually really nicely capture the issue, or ones that you think are alternatively particularly misleading? I know when I hear sort of that question, I naturally think of what's the relevance of frameworks like systemic risk in the financial system or cascade failure in terms of the relationship between infrastructures and natural disaster. Are there any that you're particularly fond of or think are effective or dislike?
Yeah. So I think human in the loop, I think is the one that's often used. And human in the loop is about how we need humans at different points of the decision-making process to help assess the risks, the challenges, and the opportunities. And so I think that's a really good way of understanding decision-making. But I think we also need to be mindful of what artificial intelligence means across these different aspects. And so AI in the loop is something that I talk about in this op-ed that I just mentioned in the previous answer of to make AI work for national security, invest in humans too. And so it's kind of the spin on words of AI in the loop versus human in the loop. And so I'd point folks to this about that. So I think that's one analogy that I do quite like and how I want to just maybe add another layer to that.
And any ones you don't like and you want to take a pot shot at?
I got to think about that. I don't know. Are there ones that folks think about? I'm not sure. That the paperclip theory. Okay, yeah, like how folks may think that with certain types of decision-making processes, if we tell the system to create an objective, right? I think it's like if we were to say make paper clips, do anything possible to do paper clips, and it would do anything in its power to create or obtain that objective. And I think that one really harsh way of thinking about automated systems, decision-making processes by machines. And so I think that's one that I do not like very much. I think that we as humans can be in control and think about the risks seriously, assess them, and be at the forefront as opposed to allowing these types of models to be at the forefront.
Other questions? All right, we have a good pack. The first three that I saw are the gentleman in the glasses in the front, person in the back, the gentleman with the dark glasses, and the person behind me.
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Hongbin Law. I'm a senior here at Temple University, Japan. So regarding to the question for the geopolitical risk, I was just kind of thinking about the future of the open source. And you also use the open source data as part of your research project. So I was just thinking of what are the futures of the open source networks and softwares?
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, great.
Hi, I'm Ira Stevens. I'm a professor of economics of sports here at TUJ and a longtime Japan person. But I just wanted to ask some simple questions like, I thought your presentation and information is like a wow. It's really lots of information, everything. So I'm wondering your background,
Yeah.
undergrad, and then you said like 7 years ago you had this like
Yeah.
emergent technologies and things like that. So some things about you, because I think your stuff is really interesting. And then a side simple question. In your research, did you, and maybe I'm off on a different tangent, just wondering about like, we're talking like AI and the numbers of people, like students or classes, academia also, and then possibly companies doing research or looking for grants and things like that. Like the numbers, is that sort of the studying or the funding or something behind some of these things maybe come into your? I know it's not in your presentation, but was there some like more background? I guess I'm doing the background questions. But
Great.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathleen Benoza from the Japan Times. So Japan is a really disaster-prone country. Well, how do you think emerging technologies can help Japan better its recovery when it comes to disasters, and just in terms of, for example, rescuing people who are victims in for example, the Noto Peninsula earthquake? How do you think Japan can improve their response with emerging technologies, is my question.
Great. Okay. I think I'll do from last question forward. So the question of how Japan specifically can be leveraging emerging technologies for disaster relief activities, I think is not just unique to Japan. I think across different countries, but especially with one that is prone to earthquakes or other types of natural disasters, I think robotics is a way forward. And I think we've witnessed quite a bit about that, where robotics can be leveraged to go in and help with search and rescue operations. Something else could be used like unmanned aerial vehicles and drones with agriculture, with different types of humanitarian aid relief packages that's been leveraged not just in Japan, but across the globe, food packages. And so I would really highlight that priority. And I think Japan has been doing so much and will continue to do that moving forward. The second question of like my background. So in undergrad, I went to Boston University. I started off as an English major, reading 16th century poetry. I quickly realized I loved English and I love writing, I like reading, but my second major, which became my primary, was political science, foreign policy. And I took a nuclear security seminar and US foreign policy making, and that like changed like my whole passion. And so I took that nuclear security seminar, I did Model UN. These were like activities that were like pivotal to me. And I remember I was in a Model UN committee called the Meiji Restoration. And I like loved it. I was like acting, right? Like I was in the zone of being my character and like taken back to a time, and like that sparked everything. So in undergrad, I really liked studying about technology and innovation, specifically about nuclear energy and tech. And I wrote like a master's thesis during undergrad through a combined BA-MA program. I was like, this is cool. I just want to keep doing this. But after undergrad, I was like, if I really want to pursue this, I have to give it a shot to be in DC and do policy. So I worked on nuclear issues at a think tank for a year. And on the first day, I told my boss, I'm going to academia. Like, I'm going to leave at a certain point. And after a year of being in DC, I went into the PhD program at Cornell in international relations and international security. I thought I was going to write my dissertation on nuclear weapons and nuclear security. And I went to a workshop in my first year of the PhD in Italy called Nuclear Technology and New Risk. And the new risk was about new innovation, about emerging tech. And I was like, wait, we keep saying emerging technology, but what is that? And that like turned into my first paper for my international security seminar. And then that became my prospectus, and then that became my dissertation. And so it went from not just studying nuclear innovation, which I draw upon, but about how other technologies have real consequences for international security. Some of my other work is about the nexus of nuclear technology and artificial intelligence. And I'm happy to share that like research with anybody who's interested in that. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
Do you teach, have you been teaching classes about, what classes do you offer?
So,
I want to go.
yeah, thanks. So at Cornell, I had the opportunity, very fortunate, to teach my own seminar called Emerging Technologies in International Security. I'm happy to give that syllabus to anybody. And it's about freshmen who come from all disciplines, biology, computer science, political science, to think about how international security is applied to different innovations. So we look at social media. We look at cyber, we look at like hacking, we look at everything, drones. So I taught that class. I've been a teaching assistant for the politics of technology, and then like the introduction to international relations, where we also think about technology towards the later half of the semester. So these are some of the classes that I've TA'd or I've been like the core instructor for. Yeah, and then I guess like the question of like, you know, open AI, like, how did I even like get to that during the PhD? Like on Twitter, like there was a tweet that was like, if you're interested in being like a research assistant for the geopolitics team, like please apply. And like I clicked on it and I was like, yeah, I absolutely do want to like know about like how OpenAI thinks about geopolitics. And for 2 years, I've been a contracted researcher when it comes to these different projects with artificial intelligence. And I think I've been really fortunate to see that side compared to not just looking at how governments, but also the private sector thinks about innovation. And I wouldn't have gotten that opportunity if I wasn't on social media. So I guess that's a note to think about. Yeah, so that's the second question. The first question I think is the hardest question of open source data. I think this is like the $1 million question of how does certain information that is publicly available impact the way that we think about the development and operationalization of tech? And we can think about GitHub as an example. Like, I don't know who has a GitHub here. I have a GitHub, and we can like look at different projects that we're working on. How many hours have you like devoted to this resource, the code that's available, and then potentially leveraging it? And I think that how this information is used to create different types of projects or models will be a priority moving forward, especially for different countries that are thinking about the forefront of innovation. I know the United States is certainly thinking about open source information, but I don't have a really great answer to that, because this is what we as individual researchers are putting onto the internet that's publicly available. And so if you have any thoughts about that, I'd be really keen to hear, or from anybody, about, you know, the extent of open source information that's available.
Well, I think that's a fairly good transition to sort of the end of our program, since we're just about at time. Oh, sorry. Who's one more question? No.
Or I can answer after.
You can ask afterwards. No, there's no preferential treatment here. So thank you all for your questions and for staying to the end of this.
Thank you.
Thanks to Julie for a phenomenal presentation. Julie, if you would take 1 second, could you go to slide 59 in your deck?
59.
59.
I have like 160.
I think we noticed.
I was prepped for my defense.
For those of you who are thinking about potentially going on to a PhD or other work, I think this is both it's your index slide with all your if asked questions.
Oh yeah.
Backup slides.
The backup slides.
Yeah, because I know that you guys are going to ask great questions. Sorry.
It's a phenomenal example.
this
I think
one.
just
Keeps changing.
Both fantastic work done, and you really want to love your topic if you're going to devote this much
For
of your
7
life to
years,
it.
yeah.
So yeah. please join me in a round of applause in a moment for thanking Julie, and also to thank our intrepid mic carrier,
Yes, thank you.
our intrepid AV staff, and Robert Jujarek and the Temple ICAS team. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Julie, again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.